Have you ever met someone who seemed too good to be true? Someone who appeared selfless, kind, and driven by a genuine desire to help others. That's exactly how people describe Teresa, a woman who built her reputation as a philanthropist and a community leader. But beneath the surface of her seemingly saintly image lay a dark secret, one that would ultimately destroy lives, betray trust, and leave a trail of devastation worth $200 million. This is not a story of redemption or sacrifice. It's a story of deception so profound, so intricately crafted, that it fooled everyone. Teresa was known as Mother Teresa in her community, not because she was a saint, but because she had carefully crafted a facade of generosity and goodwill. She convinced people that she could help them achieve financial freedom, that she was their ticket to a better future. And they believed her. Why wouldn't they? She was charming, persuasive, and most importantly, she seemed to care. But appearances can be deceiving. Teresa didn't grow up in wealth or privilege. Her story began in Florida, where she was known as an ambitious young woman with a knack for connecting with people. From an early age, she understood the power of charm and how to use it to her advantage. As she grew older, she carefully cultivated an image of success and reliability. She attended social events, donated to local charities, and always seemed to have the right words to make people feel seen and heard. By the time she was an adult, Teresa had built a network of loyal followers who admired her for her apparent selflessness. People trusted her, saw her as someone who truly wanted to make a difference. But behind closed doors, she was already laying the groundwork for something much darker. Teresa didn't just want to help people, she wanted power, control, and money. Lots of it. Her first steps into the world of financial scams were subtle. She began by convincing a few close friends to invest with her, promising high returns that seemed almost too good to be true. And they were. But at first, it worked. Teresa took the money from new investors to pay off earlier ones, creating the illusion of a thriving, legitimate operation. The word spread quickly. People began to see her as a financial genius, someone who could turn modest investments into life-changing wealth. And Teresa played the role perfectly. She didn't just sell people a dream, she made them believe in it. She spoke with conviction, painted vivid pictures of financial freedom, and assured her investors that they were part of something revolutionary. She would smile warmly, her voice soft but confident, as she told them, "Trust me, this will change your life." And they did trust her. Her operation started small, but it quickly grew. Teresa targeted anyone who would listen: retirees looking for financial security, small business owners hoping to expand, even families desperate to save for their children's futures. Her promises were irresistible. Returns of 20% or more guaranteed. All they had to do was invest their money with her, and she would take care of the rest. People were eager to believe her. They handed over their life savings, convinced that Teresa was their answer to a brighter future. And at first, it seemed like she delivered. Early investors received their returns, bolstering Teresa's reputation as a financial savant. They became her biggest advocates, singing her praises and encouraging others to join. But what these investors didn't know was that their returns weren't coming from legitimate profits. They were coming from the investments of newer victims. Teresa was running a classic Ponzi scheme, a house of cards that grew more precarious with every passing day. As the money poured in, Teresa began to live a life of unimaginable luxury. She bought sprawling mansions, drove expensive cars, and took lavish vacations. She threw extravagant parties, inviting her investors and showering them with gifts to maintain the illusion of success. Every dollar she spent came from the dreams of the people who trusted her, dreams that she was systematically destroying. Teresa's charisma and carefully crafted image allowed her scheme to grow beyond what anyone could have imagined. By the time her operation reached its peak, she had stolen $200 million from hundreds of victims. Each dollar represented someone's future, a retirement plan, a child's education, a family's hope for stability, and all of it was gone. But Teresa wasn't worried. She had built her empire on lies, but she was confident that she could keep it going. She was meticulous, creating shell companies to hide the flow of money and ensuring that no one could trace the funds back to her. She believed she was untouchable, and for years she was. But cracks were beginning to show. Payments to investors started getting delayed. Communication from Teresa became sporadic. Some victims began to grow suspicious, but they were often dismissed by others who still believed in her. Teresa would reassure them with her signature charm, saying, "Everything is under control. Trust me, we're on the verge of something big." But the truth was, the walls were closing in. The larger her scheme grew, the harder it became to keep it afloat. And while she continued to deceive those around her, some victims were quietly beginning to piece together the truth. What they discovered was worse than they could have imagined. And when it all came crashing down, the woman known as Mother Teresa would be revealed for who she truly was. Not a saint, but a cold and calculating mastermind who had destroyed countless lives in her pursuit of power and wealth. Teresa's Ponzi scheme had become a finely tuned machine of deceit. Every aspect of her operation was carefully designed to inspire trust and keep her victims invested, literally and emotionally. Her promises were bold but carefully worded, and her charm was her greatest weapon. She built relationships with her investors, making them feel like they were part of something exclusive, something groundbreaking. But behind the scenes, she was building a house of cards, one that relied on a constant influx of new victims to avoid collapse. Her scheme worked like clockwork for years. Teresa understood human nature deeply, using that knowledge to manipulate her victims. She preyed on their hopes, their fears, their desperation. Retirees trusted her because they saw her as a protector of their hard-earned money. Struggling families believed in her because she offered them a way out of financial instability. Business owners saw her as a visionary who could take them to the next level. To each person, Teresa presented herself as exactly what they needed. But Teresa wasn't just stealing their money, she was stealing their trust. Her victims believed in her so deeply that many of them encouraged their friends and family to invest. They became unwitting accomplices, spreading the word about Teresa's genius and bringing even more money into the scheme. It was a brilliant tactic on her part. The more people vouched for her, the harder it became to question her legitimacy. And so the scheme grew, ballooning to hundreds of victims and a staggering $200 million. And as her wealth grew, so did her confidence. Teresa began living a life of excess that was impossible to ignore. She purchased sprawling mansions in exclusive neighborhoods, each more opulent than the last. She drove luxury cars, wore designer clothes, and dined at the finest restaurants. She traveled the world, taking extravagant vacations that she flaunted on social media to reinforce her image of success. For Teresa, the stolen money wasn't just a means to an end, it was her way of displaying power. But her displays of wealth also served another purpose. They reassured her investors that she was the real deal. After all, who would suspect a fraudster to live so openly, so boldly? In their eyes, her lifestyle was proof that she knew what she was doing. They never stopped to wonder why someone running such a successful operation would need their money in the first place. Still, as the scheme expanded, cracks began to form. Some investors started noticing irregularities. Payments that had once been prompt began arriving late or not at all. Emails and phone calls went unanswered, Teresa's charm, once her greatest asset, began to feel like a thin veil covering something much darker. Rumors began to circulate among her victims. People started asking questions. Was Teresa really as successful as she claimed? Was their money safe? And most importantly, was she telling the truth? For those who began to suspect something was wrong, confronting Teresa was no easy task. She had built such a strong network of loyal followers that doubting her felt like heresy. Victims who expressed concern were often dismissed or ridiculed by others, who saw them as impatient or ungrateful. Teresa, for her part, was quick to smooth over any doubts. She would call meetings, flash her confident smile, and assure everyone that their money was secure. "These things take time," she'd say. "Trust me, everything is going according to plan." But behind closed doors, Teresa was panicking. The reality of her operation was beginning to catch up with her. The payments to older investors had grown so large that it was becoming harder to recruit enough new victims to cover them. Her lavish lifestyle, which had once been her shield, was now becoming a liability. Investigators were starting to take notice, and her carefully constructed empire was beginning to crumble. The turning point came when a group of victims banded together to investigate. These weren't just any victims, they were people who had lost everything. One woman, a single mother, had invested her entire savings, hoping to secure a better future for her children. When the payments stopped, she began digging into Teresa's operation and discovered inconsistencies that couldn't be explained away. She joined forces with other victims, pooling their resources to uncover the truth. What they found was staggering. Teresa's network of shell companies, her inflated promises, her extravagant spending, it all pointed to one undeniable fact. She was running a Ponzi scheme. Armed with this evidence, the victims went to law enforcement, setting off an investigation that would finally expose Teresa's dark secret. When investigators began unraveling the scheme, they were stunned by its scale. Teresa's operation was one of the largest Ponzi schemes in recent history, affecting hundreds of people and involving millions of dollars. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Bank records showed how she funneled money through her shell companies. Testimonies from victims painted a heartbreaking picture of lives ruined by her deception. And yet, even as the walls closed in, Teresa refused to take responsibility. During interviews with law enforcement, Teresa maintained her innocence, insisting that she had only ever tried to help people. She blamed external factors, market fluctuations, bad investments, and even her victims' impatience for the collapse of her operation. To the investigators, it was clear that Teresa wasn't just a fraudster. She was a master manipulator, incapable of acknowledging the harm she had caused. As the case against her grew stronger, Teresa's victims found themselves grappling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, they felt relief that she would finally face justice. On the other hand, they were devastated by the reality of their losses. For many, it wasn't just about the money, it was about the betrayal. Teresa had taken more than their savings. She had taken their trust, their hope, and their faith in humanity. That kind of loss doesn't show up on a balance sheet, but it's just as devastating. The courtroom was packed when Teresa's trial began. For months, her arrest had been the talk of the community, and now everyone wanted to see the woman who had fooled so many finally face justice. The atmosphere was tense, a mix of anger, heartbreak, and a desperate need for answers. Victims filled the seats, some clutching photographs of their families, others holding documents that represented their life savings, now gone. They had waited a long time for this moment, and the weight of their pain was palpable. The prosecution wasted no time painting a vivid picture of Teresa's crimes. They laid out the evidence meticulously, showing bank records that traced the flow of money through Teresa's web of shell companies. Charts and diagrams covered the courtroom, each one revealing how she had funneled millions of dollars to fund her extravagant lifestyle. Every transaction, every forged document, every lie she told was exposed in painstaking detail. One by one, victims took the stand, their voices shaking as they recounted their experiences. An elderly couple spoke through tears about how they had invested their retirement savings with Teresa, hoping to secure their golden years. Instead, they were left destitute, forced to sell their home and move in with relatives. A young single mother described how she had trusted Teresa with the money she had saved for her daughter's college education, only to watch it disappear. A small business owner testified that Teresa's promises of investment returns had pushed him to borrow money against his business, leaving him bankrupt when the scheme collapsed. The stories were heartbreaking, each one more devastating than the last. But what made it worse was the realization that Teresa had used her victims' trust against them. She didn't just steal their money, she stole their hope, their dreams, and their sense of security. As the testimonies continued, the courtroom grew heavier with emotion. Some victims openly wept, others sat silently, their faces etched with pain. But all of them shared the same question: why? Why had Teresa done this to them? The defense tried to argue that Teresa had never intended to harm anyone, that she had been overwhelmed by the scale of her operation and made poor decisions under pressure. They painted her as a flawed but well-meaning woman who had lost control of her business. But the evidence told a different story. Emails and text messages revealed Teresa's awareness of the scheme and her deliberate attempts to cover it up. The prosecution emphasized her lavish spending, pointing out that while her victims struggled to make ends meet, Teresa was buying luxury cars and taking extravagant vacations. When it was Teresa's turn to speak, the courtroom held its breath. This was her chance to explain herself, to show remorse, to acknowledge the pain she had caused. But instead of taking responsibility, she doubled down on her defense. She insisted that she had started with good intentions, that she had wanted to help people. She blamed market conditions, bad luck, and even her victims for the collapse of her operation. "People expected too much, too fast," she said at one point, her tone cold and detached. Her words were met with audible gasps and murmurs from the audience. To those who had suffered because of her, it felt like another betrayal. The judge's response to Teresa's lack of accountability was swift and sharp. In his closing remarks, he addressed her directly, his voice steady but laced with anger. "You have shown no remorse for the lives you've destroyed," he said. "You manipulated the hopes and dreams of hundreds of people for your own personal gain. Your actions were not mistakes. They were calculated choices driven by greed. This court cannot ignore the devastation you have caused." When the sentence was handed down, 20 years in federal prison, there was a mix of reactions in the courtroom. Some victims felt a sense of relief, knowing that Teresa would finally face consequences for her actions. Others were frustrated, believing the punishment didn't match the scale of her crimes. 20 years won't bring back our savings, our homes, or our futures, one victim said outside the courthouse. "She stole so much more than money. She stole our trust." As Teresa was led away in handcuffs, her expression remained stoic. She showed no visible emotion, no sign of regret. For many, this was the final confirmation of her true nature, a woman who cared only for herself, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of her guilt. But while the trial had ended, the pain she left behind would linger for years. Her victims returned to lives that would never be the same. Some faced financial ruin, others struggled with the emotional scars of betrayal. Yet, despite their pain, many found solace in the fact that her story had been brought to light. They hoped that by sharing their experiences, they could prevent others from falling prey to similar schemes. Teresa's trial became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of blind trust and the devastating consequences of unchecked greed. As the courthouse emptied and the media frenzy died down, one question remained. How could someone who appeared so kind, so trustworthy, be capable of such cruelty? For her victims, there would never be a satisfying answer. But their voices, their stories, and their fight for justice ensured that Teresa's name would be remembered not as a saint, but as a warning to all who crossed her path. When Teresa was escorted out of the courtroom to begin her 20-year sentence, the weight of what had happened hung heavily in the air. For her victims, it was a moment of bittersweet finality. Justice had been served, at least in the eyes of the law. But the question remained, was it enough? How could 20 years in prison possibly compensate for the devastation she had caused, for the dreams she had shattered, and the lives she had upended? Outside the courthouse, emotions ran high. Some victims expressed relief that Teresa was finally being held accountable, but others couldn't hide their frustration. "It feels hollow," one man said. "She'll be out in 20 years, maybe less, but I'll be dealing with the consequences of her actions for the rest of my life." A woman, clutching a photograph of her late husband, who had passed away shortly after losing their life savings, said through tears, "He died believing we'd been foolish, that it was our fault for trusting her. How do you forgive that?" The debate didn't stop there. Social media exploded with reactions to the case. Some argued that Teresa's sentence was fair, considering the scope of her crimes and the evidence against her. Others believed it was far too lenient. "She stole 200 million and ruined hundreds of lives," one commenter wrote. "How is 20 years enough for that? Some people get longer sentences for far less." Another added, "It's not just about the money. It's the emotional damage, the betrayal. You can't put a price on that." But there were also those who questioned the victims themselves. "How could so many people fall for this?" one person commented. "Didn't they see the red flags?" These remarks sparked heated debates, with others rushing to defend the victims. "It's easy to judge when you're not the one being manipulated," one reply read. Teresa was a master manipulator. She didn't just steal their money, she stole their trust and their hope. That's what makes this so tragic. The conversations weren't just about Teresa's actions, they were about broader questions of morality and justice. What does justice really look like in cases like this? Can a prison sentence ever truly make up for the harm caused by such a large-scale betrayal? And what about the systems that allowed Teresa to operate her scheme for so long? Were there warning signs that authorities missed? Could this all have been prevented? The victims, for their part, were clear in their message. They wanted people to learn from what had happened to them. Many spoke out in interviews and social media posts, sharing their stories in the hope that others might recognize the signs of fraud before it's too late. "If something seems too good to be true, it probably is," one victim warned. But it's not just about being cautious, it's about holding people accountable, about making sure there are safeguards in place to protect those who are vulnerable. Even now, Teresa's story continues to spark questions and discussions. How could someone with such a saintly reputation hide such a dark side? Was she always this way, or did greed corrupt her over time? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, could someone like Teresa be walking among us right now, building a similar web of lies, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? What do you think? Was 20 years in prison enough for what Teresa did? Should her sentence have been harsher, or do you think justice was served? And what about the victims? How do we, as a society, support people who've been through something like this? Could better regulations have prevented this tragedy? Or was it inevitable, given Teresa's manipulative brilliance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about trust, greed, and justice. Could this happen again? And if it could, how do we stop it? This is more than just a story about one woman's crimes. It's a reminder of the impact that deception can have on all of us. So tell us, what's your take on the rise and fall of Mother Teresa? Your opinion matters, and your voice could help others avoid becoming victims of schemes like this. Let's talk about it.